Hey folks, it's that time again where I arrogantly take a movie that has some problems and try to fix it. Today I'll be talking about the well-loved Superman 3, and just like when I did a rewrite on Superman 2, not only am I fixing this movie, but I'm making it a sequel to my fix for the previous Superman movie. So with that being said, let's get into it. Okay, so a big problem with Superman 3 is that it doesn't really feel like a sequel to the previous movie. At least with Superman 2, no matter which cut you get, it's connected to the first movie. But Superman 3 almost feels like a soft reboot. You have the same actors playing the principal cast, but half of the main characters are barely in the movie, if they're in it at all. And part of this is the movie makers making lemonade out of lemons, since Margot Kidder and Gene Hackman wanted as little to do with this movie as possible because they didn't like how Richard Donner was treated during production of Superman 2. Strange that Donner getting fired didn't stop them from doing Superman 4, but that's neither here nor there. More than half the movie is set in Smallville, which might as well be a brand new location with how little of the story of the previous movies was set there. And we have Lana Lang as a prominent character when the last time we saw her was in passing in a flashback in Superman 1 for less than 10 minutes. That, combined with the fact that the story we get here just isn't very good, means that I'll be scrapping almost all of this movie and coming up with something almost completely different, in case you were wondering why it took me a lot longer to do this video than my fix for Superman 2. I think my biggest problem with this movie, by itself, not part of the entire franchise, is that we have an A plot and a B plot that don't even bother intersecting with each other until halfway into the movie. We spend a lot of time setting up Clark going to Smallville, meeting with Lana again, introducing Gus Gorman and his down on his luck status quo, him stealing from his new boss, and then him being used by his new boss to secure lucrative business opportunities using computer bull signs. It isn't until Superman interferes with their man-made act of God in Colombia, halfway into the movie, that Gus's boss decides that Superman must be dealt with, and that's where we get the synthetic kryptonite that propels the plot of the last half of the film, with Superman inexplicably acting like a jerk because less than 1% of the kryptonite was made from tar. Then, just as inexplicably, his personality is split in two, an evil version and a good version, and the good version strangles the evil version to death. Like, Superman breaks the Judeo-Christian ethic of thou shalt not kill, mentally speaking, and then he's back to being a pure innocent good guy again. Oh, and Superman slept with that one woman. Hey, instead of Superman Returns featuring Superman's illegitimate son with Lois, it should have had his illegitimate son with this lady. Seriously, a Superboy with a kinda criminal for a mother, and he isn't necessarily evil, but he also doesn't have the pure wholesome upbringing of Superman and has to live in his father's shadow. That'd be kinda neat to, no, I'm not fixing Superman Returns right now, I need to focus on Superman 3. So even though the plot of this movie is a complete disaster, there's still some elements that I think I could reuse, but it's like the opposite of Gus's synthetic kryptonite. We can use about 1% of this movie, and the rest we will need to take out and replace with something else, like tar. So the first things first, we're getting rid of Lana Lang and giving Lois more screen time than what she had in this movie. In the hypothetical world where I rewrite these movies, Richard Donner didn't get canned in the middle of Superman 2, so Margot Kidder didn't want out of this movie. And it's nothing against the character of Lana Lang, mind you. I actually like this version of Lana better than this version of Lois, if we're being honest. She likes Clark for Clark, not for him being Superman. That instantly makes her more endearing than Lois. But after we've spent 2 movies setting up a romance between Clark and Lois, and my revision of Superman 2 did not have Clark deciding that he couldn't have a girlfriend, that means that we don't need to unceremoniously get rid of Lois. And so we don't need to shoehorn Lana in this movie, and therefore we don't need to spend more than half of the movie in Smallville. Next, let's change Man from Uncle here into Morgan Edge, who was kinda involved with Intergang in the comics in the 1970s. The evil businessman guy requires almost no change at all to turn him into Morgan Edge, since everything that he does in this movie, like trying to take over the coffee industry and the oil industry, seems like things that Morgan Edge, via Intergang, would do. And since my rewrite of Superman 2 already introduced Intergang, it makes sense to now introduce the man pulling the strings. Ho-ho, it's almost like that was planned in advance. And since Superman has already meddled in the affairs of Intergang in the previous movie, we've already got a motivation for why Morgan Edge would want Superman out of the picture before he continues with his illicit activities. And we can get this plot ball rolling a little earlier than halfway into the movie. And instead of a man-made supercomputer that can do anything, including turn Man from Uncle's sister, I guess woman from Uncle, into a cyborg, let's turn that into Brainiac. The special effects of 1983 weren't as good as you would want them to be to do Brainiac correctly, but we already had all 3 Star Wars movies by this point, and say what you will about any of them, the makeup and costumes for the aliens looked really good. So while the giant robot version of Brainiac that was around in the comics at this time might not look good on screen, you could easily do the Koluan green-skinned humanoid version of Brainiac from the Silver Age. Give him some pants and he'd be fine in this movie. As for how to get him into the plot of the movie, I would say that when Superman accidentally released Zod and his allies from the Phantom Zone at the beginning of Superman 2, Brainiac, on the other end of space, somehow found out that the Phantom Zone had been opened. Maybe his spaceship was programmed to alert him when that happened, I don't know. Now, instead of Brainiac kidnapping an entire city and shrinking it down like he does in the comics, I do what the Superman the Animated Series model model of Brainiac did, and say that he absorbs information and then moves on to the next planet. Maybe he intends to use the information he gathers to efficiently run the entire universe, I'm not sure. The comics never did really come up with a satisfying reason why Brainiac does what he does, and since there's been like 5 different versions of Brainiac, I think it's okay to fudge on his modus operandi in this movie. As for why Brainiac comes into play in this movie, maybe he initially believes humanity is responsible for opening the Phantom Zone, and he intends to destroy Earth because a society with that kind of power poses a threat to him. And then when he sees Superman and the power he possesses, he wants to somehow put Superman under his control. Oh, and I would not connect Brainiac to Krypton. Superman the Animated Series and Smallville both did that, and while I didn't hate it in either of those shows, I don't think that it works in the narrative that we've established here in my fix videos. If the destruction of Krypton is something the people could have prevented, but chose not to act, then connecting Brainiac to the planet's destruction makes it seem like it was out of their hands. And so Jor-El and Zod talking about how inept the council was, that all works a little bit less. So Brainiac was in no way responsible for Krypton's destruction in this movie. And I'd also be removing Richard Pryor's character Gus Gorman from this movie. Since I've never seen Richard Pryor in anything other than this movie, I can't fairly comment on his comedic talent, but I can fairly say that in this movie he is not funny at all. Well, that's not entirely true. I did chuckle at his over-the-top, the boss is going to be P.O.'d bit with Brad, but during the rest of the movie, I never once laughed or even smiled with a character who I guess is supposed to be comic relief, but he's responsible for all of the horrible stuff that happens in this movie, except for the chemical fire that Clark stops on his way to Smallville. Plus, this movie focuses a lot of its time on Gus and not so much on Superman. Even less on Superman when like a fourth of the movie is evil Superman. This being a Superman movie, I really feel like Superman should be the focus. So when we take all of that away, what do we have left? Well, not a lot. We've got Morgan Edge and Brainiac, and we're keeping the synthetic kryptonite, though it'll be delivered in a completely different way. But other than that, this fix is really more of a completely brand new movie rather than a few tweaks on an existing film like my fixes on the previous Superman movies. But that's okay because I've already committed to doing these Superman movies, so let's get into it. We begin our movie with Brainiac warping to our solar system, and he does some investigating, sees that humanity is not advanced enough to open the Phantom Zone, and investigates further to see that Superman has been active on Earth for a few months, and he's responsible for the Phantom Zone opening. Brainiac can be talking to his computer, and he mentions offhand that he heard legends of Krypton and regretted never getting a chance to examine that planet in person. So with Brainiac wanting to rule the universe once he has accumulated all of the knowledge that he can, he believes someone as physically powerful as Superman could help him do that much quicker. And maybe Brainiac thinks Superman has some access to the accumulated knowledge of dead Krypton, not knowing that Superman knows basically nothing other than what Zod mentioned offhand in the previous movie. But while Brainiac does have a highly advanced ship, he doesn't want to just jump in guns blazing. He's cautious, and when he tips his hand to Superman, he wants to be sure it's when he's 100% certain that he can get Superman on his side. Cut to a meeting with all of the leaders of Intergang and their number one boss, Bruno Mannheim. Mannheim is on thin ice with his collaborators after the failures of his group of foot soldiers in Superman 2. The solar energy reactor thing was a surefire way to put Intergang on the map. By now, they could have had the entire planet eating out of their hand with threats of using the solar energy reactor thing, but Mannheim's goons failed. The other leaders of Intergang have already voted, and they kill Mannheim, and Morgan Edge, who has up until now been running some of the public facets of Intergang. In the Lois and Clark TV show, Intergang is led by a guy named Bill Church Sr., who publicly owns a supermarket chain. So something like that, maybe not supermarket chains exactly, but something is going to be funneling a lot of money under the table for Intergang's more gangsterish activities, is now promoted to being in charge. Edge's first move is to purchase the Daily Planet, the biggest newspaper in the world, and use it to discredit Superman after everything that went down in the previous movie. People are still a little wary of Superman after seeing what an unleashed Kryptonian can do. Edge wants to jump on that and fan the flames even more. If the people don't want Superman, Edge can't imagine that Superman will want them. This will provide our emotional core of the movie, which is something that was kind of lacking in the movie that we got. We had that one moment where Superman is sad because he let someone die when he was trying to get in Lana's pants, but then he continued being evil prankster Superman for like another 15 minutes. So that emotional thrust didn't really have any impact on the film as a whole. So anyway, Lois, Clark, Perry, and Jimmy are not happy about the direction their new boss wants to take the planet, but there's not much that they can do about it. Perry even thinks about quitting because he's that disenchanted with Morgan Edge micromanaging the planet, but he sticks with it when he sees Lois and Clark fighting the power. Oh, and speaking of, Lois and Clark are publicly dating now, and Clark's public personality has changed a little bit since they started dating. Before, he was quiet and timid, mostly just trying not to be noticed because he didn't want to draw unnecessary attention to himself and risk someone finding out about his dual identity, which happened anyway with Lois. But with Lois as his ally, she is able to help him in different ways to conceal his secret identity without removing his own confident justice-doing self from the equation when he's wearing his Clark clothes. Anytime Clark disappears from the scene as Superman shows up, Lois helps come up with better excuses to cover for Clark. Even if the excuses are just as good as what Clark used to come up with, the fact that someone else is vouching for him during his disappearances helps with his alibi. The two of them are still trying to write positive stories about Superman, but are only sticking to the facts when they do so. They argue with Edge that they're not supporting or opposing Superman and are just here to report on what what they see. So we may see Edge put out a hit on them at some point because he figures it will be easier to just quietly get rid of them than to fire them and thus turn them into martyrs. But if they accidentally fall off a bridge or something and it doesn't look like murder and isn't connected to him, then they don't become martyrs and he can go back to turning Superman into public enemy number 1 with no obstacles. So then we'll get a fun scene where Clark sees the Intergang hitman and knows that he can't die, but the hitman doesn't know that, so Clark has to get creative on how to avoid his secret being blown. Something kind of sort of like that scene in All-Star Superman where Clark saves people by being clumsy. I want to really show Clark's struggle with being Superman during all of this. Of course he's not doing all of this so that people will praise him. He's doing it to help people who need help. But I've stressed in these fixed videos before that Clark is basically human, just with larger-than-life abilities. So if everyone is constantly yelling at you that what you're doing isn't good enough, eventually that's going to wear a body down, even a super body like Clark. This would be where a lot of Lois and Clark's relationship stuff would, in theory, shine, because Clark is still pretty new at this whole hero thing, and while he was doing some of it when his dad was still alive, neither of his parents really knew how to help Clark with his problems in becoming Superman. So Lois will be there to reassure Superman that yes, there is some loud dissent, but that is the very vocal minority. But I don't want Lois's only reason for being in this movie to be to cheer Superman up. She needs something more to do. So remember that through line that was introduced in my fix for Superman 2 where Superman said that he didn't think that he could spend time in a relationship because it would take away from his time saving the planet? Well, even though Clark and Lois are dating now, and Clark is starting to come out of his shell a little bit, he is still very unsure of how to proceed with this relationship. Even though Lois has helped him shed some of the facade that he's created in trying to hide his identity, she still feels like that he's hiding so much from her. A lot of Superman's concerns about the people hating him, he won't be that forthcoming about why he's so glum. She'll really have to pry his secrets from him, and she'll be a little frustrated that he's not being more open with her. So anyway, at the next Intergang meeting, Brainiac shows up. He announces that he's been listening in on news outlets and secret radio transmissions, and he offers his assistance to Intergang because they share a common enemy. Of course, at this point, Brainiac sees Superman as a tool that he can make use of, and not necessarily someone who needs to be eliminated. So I should mention that Intergang has been attempting to create their own synthetic kryptonite because pieces of legitimate kryptonite are incredibly hard to find, and very expensive if you can find it. Even Lex Luthor, running his own criminal empire that was about the same size as Intergang, had just one piece of kryptonite, and it went missing when Luthor went to prison. We'll even say that Mannheim had people infiltrate Star Labs before the completion of the solar energy reactor thing, and that's how Intergang was able to nearly steal it at the beginning of my version of Superman 2. And those moles are all maybe still at Star Labs, now reporting to Edge, and before Mannheim died, they were saying that the top brass at Star Labs has kryptonite locked away in the event that Superman goes bad, which we saw at the end of my fix for Superman 2. But when Mannheim tried to get them to steal the kryptonite, no, we can't do that, it needs a presidential authorization code and 14 people turning keys simultaneously, and basically if we want kryptonite, we're gonna have to make it ourselves. So one of Mannheim's pet projects was trying to reproduce the effects of real kryptonite while not using the entire Intergang budget. And so now Brainiac comes to Edge and the other leaders of Intergang offering his help in destroying Superman only because he's been listening in on their communications and has heard numerous references to the kryptonite project that they still have going. Edge himself barely even remembers that Intergang had such a project, but thinks that he can outmaneuver Brainiac and use him, while Brainiac wants to use Edge and Intergang. Edge says, sure, you can use our kryptonite stuff, and maybe you could give us some cool fancy weapons to use in our daily operations. Brainiac doesn't care about what Intergang is doing, so gives Edge some stuff that's really advanced for humans, but is basically crap compared to what Brainiac has accumulated over the years. Brainiac takes the synthetic kryptonite and lures Superman into a meeting. Brainiac gives his sales pitch as to why Superman should join him. And I'm just gonna throw this out there, but it seems like movies do this a lot, where the villain asks the hero to join forces with them. Like, why do you think the good guy is going to sign up for your shenanigans? Goblin does this in Spider-Man 1, Darth Vader does this in Empire Strikes Back, Sebastian Shaw does this to the kid of the woman he straight up murdered in X-Men First Class, Kurt does this to Ed in Good Burger. The only time I've ever seen this where I thought it worked and was plausible was the Alec Baldwin Shadow movie, because Cranston was a maniacal, bloodthirsty conqueror before he became a superhero, so it makes sense that another maniacal, bloodthirsty conqueror would offer him a piece of the action. But I said all of that to say this. Brainiac makes this offer because he doesn't know Superman. I guess this harkens back to Zod and Ursa so fundamentally not understanding Superman's love for humanity in Superman 2. Brainiac really is more like a computer than an organic being, so he doesn't get why someone so much stronger than the natives of this planet would selflessly give his life for them like he has been. So Brainiac probably mentions that Superman doesn't have to keep up with this long con anymore, and the two of them can so much more effectively take the resources they need to rule the entire galaxy together. Obviously, Superman says no, and Brainiac releases the synthetic kryptonite, but it doesn't work. Superman starts punching Brainiac, and Brainiac beams his consciousness into another backup body back on his ship. Before Brainiac's consciousness leaves his body, we'll see the little fixtures on Brainiac's head, which I'm going to say here they are lights. They will start to blink, indicating Brainiac is preparing to leave this body. This will be important later. Anyway, if you've seen Superman 3, then you probably guessed the synthetic kryptonite has has the same effects as red kryptonite from Smallville, loosening Superman's moral code a little bit. And I cannot believe that I'm going to say this, but I would play this in a similar manner to how the symbiote affects Spider-Man in Spider-Man 3. Our Dark Superman won't be pulling silly pranks like straightening the Leaning Tower of Pisa or blowing out the Olympic torch, but instead, he will continue trying to do what he always does, saving lives, being super, that sort of thing. But with Morgan Edge using his various media outlets to sway public opinion on Superman, even before he was doused with synthetic kryptonite, he was already struggling with, does the world need a Superman? And now that he's got a touch of darkness in him, his doubts will be compounded. So if he saves someone from a near-miss car accident, but they make an offhand remark about how their car got scratched when he saved them, maybe before, Superman would have shrugged it off. But now, maybe he throws the car into outer space and gives a sarcastic salute to the guy he just saved and flies off. Now, an important thing we need to establish is how long the effects of the synthetic kryptonite will last. In the pre-Crisis on Infinite Earths comics, red kryptonite would last for a day, so let's go with that. That gives us plenty of time for Superman to do lots of uncharacteristic things under the influence. He probably doesn't even show up for work, and Lois covers for him, saying that he felt really sick this morning, and Perry doesn't even think twice about it, and truthfully barely even noticed that Kent was gone, because everyone's talking about the heated argument that Superman got into with the chief of police. So Perry's gonna have a quiet conversation with Lois where he will ask her if she thinks that Superman finally got tired of the people of Metropolis basically walking all over him, or if something else is going on. Remember, Lois is the one who introduced Superman to the people of Earth with her exclusive in the first movie, so Perry and probably everyone else at the planet is kind of raising their eyebrows, expecting her to know what's going on. And of course, she's already talked with Clark about what he's been troubled with, but she doesn't know about the synthetic kryptonite, so she honestly tells Perry that she has no idea what's going on, but she's going to get to the bottom of it. But before she leaves, Perry presses her and says she didn't answer his question. Do you think that Superman's a danger to us mere mortals? Lois maybe looks down at the headline for the afternoon edition about Superman terrorizing the cops, and she hesitates before saying, no, I don't think so. But get ready for some melodrama because Superman was probably overhearing this conversation from like 3 miles away. So Superman's uncharacteristic behavior is going to make Morgan Edge realize that maybe the kryptonite that he had didn't have the desired effect, but it did have an effect. And he tries to tell Brainiac this, but Brainiac's having none of it. Edge has already failed him once, and kryptonite that turns Superman slightly bad doesn't do Brainiac any good at all when he needs some muscle to help him take over the planet and the rest of the galaxy, which Superman is still uninterested in doing. So Brainiac kills Edge and busts out some headsets identical to what he wears, and they fly onto the heads of the Intergang scientists. While Brainiac has no interest in taking over Intergang, he does need their resources to remove the threat of Superman, so anyone fortunate enough to not be a scientist is all too willing to do whatever Brainiac says. Brainiac knows that even now, Superman won't join him, so he decides that he would be better off if he tried to create his own Superman instead. And you may be asking, why didn't Brainiac just do that instead of trying to lure Superman to the dark side? Well, even for a super genius like Brainiac, creating the clone is the easy part, but teaching it and training it, not so much. Now, Brainiac does have entire civilizations of knowledge in his head, so in theory, he could do the opposite of what he usually does and share the knowledge he has with a newly created clone. But Brainiac is not unjustly afraid that if he does that, the clone will turn on him. I mean, if someone with the powers of Superman has Brainiac's knowledge, what does he need Brainiac for? But going in the other direction will also be problematic. If Brainiac tries to deliberately keep the clone dumb, he might also be hard to steer in the right direction. Nevertheless, Brainiac knows that he needs to deal with Superman before the effects of the synthetic kryptonite wear off, because Superman won't stand by and allow Brainiac to continue his activities now that he's made his presence known. So Brainiac hastily creates a clone, which we all know is Bizarro, but we won't be calling him that in this movie. And it won't have the chalky stone skin either. It'll look a lot like Superman, but it can't think like Superman. Bizarro is one of those characters who you can play for laughs, and people who are not me will enjoy it, or you can play him scary, and that's kind of what I would want to do here. Someone with Superman's strength, but without the moral compass or even any kind of mentality at all to rein in the power, just the raw strength. So Brainiac sends out a team with some of the fancy weapons he gave Edge earlier to rob a bank or something. He doesn't really care what they do, it just has to distract Superman enough so that one of the guys can get some of his DNA for Brainiac to work with. Anyway, the trap works, Superman arrives, and after hearing Lois say that maybe he is a danger to the people he has spent so long trying to protect, he's ready to knock some heads together. He doesn't kill anyone, but he does indulge in some unnecessary violence. So while the one guy that got away, maybe his team was instructed to use some ultrasonic noise to keep Superman from following the sound of one guy escaping, the rest of the team is captured for the police, and Superman will hear the chief of police talking to the head of Star Labs. Emil Hamilton still hadn't been created in the comics at this point, so it wouldn't be him. I don't know, maybe it could be Silas Stone? I'm not saying that we're setting up Cyborg for a cameo or a spin-off movie, but since his dad was a Star Labs employee, this could be a cute little reference. Anyway, the chief of police is saying that this fiasco is all the proof Stone needs. It will take weeks for the mayor to make a decision on this, but Superman is a menace now. We need that kryptonite now, Professor. I'm not saying that we'll immediately use it once we have it, but I think our officers would be much safer if they didn't have to worry about what Superman might do to them if they make him mad. And of course, hearing that they've got contingencies against him doesn't exactly ease Superman's mind at all. Before Professor Stone can agree to anything, and before Superman can go down there and give both of them a piece of his mind, the police scanner says that there's a possible jumper on the Daily Planet building. The police chief says that he knows Superman is angry, but he has to save the civilian. But Superman says that she's not in danger and flies to meet Lois on top of the Daily Planet. She says she had to do something dramatic to get his attention with how he's been acting since his encounter with Brainiac, who I realize would have no reason to call himself that, and with Brainiac only having one public appearance so far, the people would have no reason to call him that either, but whatever, that's a second draft problem. We'll basically continue the conversation that Lois and Clark had earlier in the movie about his frustrations with everything he does not being good enough and the people still fearing him. Lois basically says that he's being an idiot right now, and that if he wants the trust of the people, he has to earn it. Sure, there's people like Morgan Edge who will lash out at you no matter what you do, but you know that everyone on the planet isn't like him. You saved us from Luthor, you saved us from Zod. The people know that you're on their side, but there's still a lot they don't know about you. They don't know about how you almost died saving them. They don't know that you would give your life for them in a heartbeat, even after everything that they've said about you. So before they can continue the conversation any further, Brainiac's new Superman clone attacks Star Labs. See, Superman wasn't the only one who overheard a conversation about the piece of kryptonite that Star Labs had. Brainiac heard about it, and he wants to use that in case his clone doesn't work. Now, even though Bizarro looks like Superman, people will pretty easily be able to tell that this is not him. Even with Superman being pretty grouchy for the past day, this guy is clearly not Superman. He's not even using real words, he's just screaming incoherently. And when Superman comes in to try and stop the clone, the people surrounding the area will definitely be able to see, okay, that's the real deal. We'll see that this clone has some kind of earpiece that Brainiac is communicating with him through, and Superman will, with his super hearing, hear Brainiac, who he and everyone else thought was dead, giving commands to the clone. Brainiac tells the clone to attack Superman, the fight rages for a little bit, and whenever the clone starts to lose focus, Superman will notice a small device implanted on the clone's arm that emits the effects of red solar radiation, but released in such a way that it causes the clone pain when it's turned on. This will keep the clone on track so that it doesn't wander off with its own mindless agenda. So Superman tries to get the earpiece off the clone, but unsuccessfully at first. So when Brainiac starts to see that the fight is pretty much a stalemate, he changes his strategy and has the clone go after the civilians. And here's where Superman gets his mojo back. Superman saves the chief of police from a car flying through the air or something, and Superman says something charming like, "I'll leave the safety of everyone here in your hands, Chuck," and he'll go back to fighting the clone. Maybe at this point someone has opened the safe with the kryptonite, and it hurts the clone and Superman. The chief is all like, "No, put it back," but Superman says, no, this is okay. He uses this opportunity to pull the red solar radiation thing off the clone and remove the earpiece. Then Superman, almost collapsed on the floor, picks up a piece of lead or something and covers the kryptonite. The clone is confused because he has been conditioned to see Superman as an enemy, but he just did something nice for him. Rather than continue the fight, the clone flees, and Superman knows that he will have to deal with that eventually, but the bigger threat here is Brainiac. Superman uses his microscopic vision to look at the red solar radiation machine and sees that it has something on it that Intergang uses in some of their weapons that they've been using recently. Superman follows a hunch that Brainiac is allied with Intergang, and from there it is pretty easy to track down Brainiac. And while Superman is physically stronger than Brainiac, Brainiac's got an infinite number of bodies back on the spaceship, but Superman doesn't let it come to that. Brainiac is about to transfer his consciousness to the ship, where he could probably destroy the whole planet or at least eliminate all organic life with the push of a button. But Superman stops him by removing the headset thing with all the lights on it. It doesn't kill Brainiac, but it definitely hurts him, and more importantly, it limits him to one body, effectively removing the threat he poses to the galaxy. Sure, his ship is still out there with lots of inert Brainiac bodies inside, but with no mind guiding them, they pose no threat to Earth. I'd kinda like to do a thing where Superman thinks Brainiac is down for the count, but Brainiac turns on some red solar lamps and tries one last-ditch effort to kill Superman. But Lois shoots Brainiac in the shoulder, stopping his attack. It may seem a little goofy, but I want Lois to be more than just an emotional crutch for Superman when he feels down. This take on Lois might make more sense when her dad is a 5-star United States general, which was just a couple of years away from happening in the comics. So maybe it doesn't make much sense for this to come into play here, but I like it. With Brainiac defeated, he goes to jail for murdering Morgan Edge, as well as leaving the Intergang scientist brain dead. While it might be weird for Brainiac to be put in a regular prison, I don't see this version of Brainiac being super strong like some versions of Brainiac from the comics, so I would see no reason for Superman to dust off the Phantom Zone projector again. Plus, I don't want that to become a crutch he relies on in each movie either. And that would be my fix for Superman 3, which really is just a completely new movie from the ground up. But I warned you about that. There's virtually nothing from Superman 3 that we got that works with what I did with Superman 1 and 2, so I did what I could. I admit this isn't as fleshed out as my fixes on Superman 1 and 2, but this is less than a first draft. I'm just laying down the basic structure of what could be done, but more could be added on and fleshed out later in this hypothetical universe where this would become a movie. So what did you guys think? More importantly, what would you do differently if you had to go at fixing Superman 3? And what are some movies that you think I should take a crack at fixing? I've got my own ideas, but you guys might have thought of something that I didn't think of. So throw those suggestions in the comments. In the meantime, I'll see you guys with other videos, including other movie fixes in the near future. Until then, take care.